recovery, which will explore the government's furloughing scheme, how it should evolve as we move into the recovery phase, and then in a sense what that means for our cities and towns across the country. In a moment, we're going to hear from our two speakers, Paul Swinney and Vicky Pryce. As always, the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website along with the slides after the event. During the event, we encourage you to adopt the speaker view on the function. And as always, keep your mics on mute unless you're asking a question so we don't get any feedback or outside noise. And the hashtag for the event is CFC Recovery. After we've heard from Paul and Vicky, which will be 20-25 minutes, we'll then have about 30 minutes for questions from you. So think about your questions. You don't have to wait until the end to post your questions. If a question occurs to you while you're listening to Paul and or Vicky, you can stick them, I can send it to us rather than wait until the end. You can do that by sending a message to ask a question, and then we will finish just before 12 o'clock because Vicky is much in demand and has to be somewhere else, virtually at least anyway. So that's how the event is going to run this morning. So over to the presentations. Our first presentation is from my colleague Paul Swinney. Paul is the Director of Policy and Research at the Centre. He's going to set out our thinking about the recovery phase and then how that applies and the implications of that for our cities and towns. Paul, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. So what I want to do quite briefly is set out our thinking around how we should be thinking about what is a very complex subject. You know, the Chancellor has been doing a lot of thinking about this, policymakers have been doing a lot of thinking about how do you try and roll back the range of policies that have been put in place to deal with the depth of the crisis, and how do you do that in a way that you don't actually stop the recovery before it's even started. Now, because this is so complex, I think we haven't really got any clarity about which way we'll go forward on that. I think what I'm going to propose here is a framework for trying to think that through. So I'm trying to take that complex, tricky area and put it into simpler terms, which then gives us a way of thinking about this problem. And I'll make a number of policy suggestions too. Those policy suggestions are up for debate, but crucially, I think it is how does the framework help us then help guide us to what those policy recommendations should be, and hopefully we can have a bit of a chat about that after. So, in order to think about this, there are two principles I want to take you through to hold in mind. And the first is that what government should be trying to do is move from a position of supporting businesses, as it currently is to supporting workers. Now, the reason for this is because there's two reasons why, or principal reasons why a business would fail in the current circumstances. One is that there's a short-term cash flow issue or debt problems because you haven't got income coming in, but you have still got revenue going out or expenditure going out of the door, and you literally haven't got enough money coming in to pay the bills. The second one is that actually there's a longer-term fall in demand for your good or your service, and actually there's something more fundamental going on with your business, which means that irrespective of the crisis, you're just in trouble. And those two positions require a very different policy response. So in terms of the short-term issues about cash flow, we have the policies we put in place. So it's things like the furloughing scheme, there's the loans that have been put in place and the grants that have been offered up too. And they're very much about trying to make sure that viable businesses can get through the storm, still remain solvent when lockdown lifted, and hopefully they can continue to trade again. But the second position in terms of businesses failing because there's a more fundamental problem with their business or people not wanting to buy from them, we don't really want to be in a position where government is continuing to subsidise those businesses when actually they're not viable in the longer term. And this is the tricky challenge that the government has got in terms of trying to roll back those policies to support the viable companies, but doesn't continue to keep those companies on life support that ultimately are not going to remain open. That's a particularly great use of taxpayers' money. And so what we then say is that in this instance, we should then see a movement away from support to the business through to trying to support workers more directly in terms of getting back into work. The second principle that sort of guides this is that different businesses play different roles in the economy. And what we do is we put businesses into two broad groups. The first group, you've got what we would describe as being local services. So they're shops, cafes, bars, restaurants, the type of amenities that are on your doorstep that very much sell to a local market. Think about the high street and the types of businesses that are on there, for example, to conjure up those types of businesses. Then the second group is the exporters group. Now, these are the businesses that sell beyond their local market. They sell to regional, national, or international markets. So think about your finance companies, software development, marketing companies, etc. Now, these companies are very, very important to a local economy because they help bring money in from elsewhere. You know, they bring money into the local economy, they bring prosperity into the local economy. And if that exporting base is roaring, then your local economy is going to tick over nicely. And then the money that is generated from that, people then go out and spend on cafes, bars, restaurants, etc. But crucially, you've got to have this exporting base in place. You've got to have those exporters performing well if you want people to be going out and spending money in cafes, bars, and restaurants. Now, the reason for, or because of the very different role that those two types of business plays, means we should treat them in a slightly different way. So let's get into then what this then means in terms of the policy approach. Well, we'd split the period into 3 phases. Phase 1 is where we are currently. We've got the COVID job retention scheme in place, which most people know about. And then there's a range of other policies in place too, such as bounce back loans. There's some grants available, etc., which are all about trying to keep all businesses solvent. And that is a blanket approach. There's no sort of split between sector. But as we start to roll back these things and try to encourage the recovery, and crucially get the recovery to happen across the country and not just in certain parts of the country, we're going to have to take a slightly varied approach in terms of how we deal with this, which moves us into phase 2. Now, phase 2, we've seen it has been a temporary phase. It's a transition phase. It wouldn't probably last longer than 2 months, so it is very short in its approach. But we do see this difference then in terms of how we support different types of businesses. So for those exporting businesses, it's business as usual in terms of policy. We keep the furloughing scheme in place. We keep the other short-term schemes in place because we want to make sure that we maintain a safety net for those types of businesses to help them get back on their feet. Because that is crucial not only in the short term, but actually the longer term, because of the way that these businesses bring prosperity into different places. But for local services, it would change the approach. So we would enter the phase 2 when lockdown is lifted for most types of businesses. So we can all then go back to the pubs and restaurants and cafes if we so choose to. So these businesses in principle can trade. But what the big concern there is that just because lockdown has been lifted, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are actually going to go back out again. So for these people, for these businesses, what we should be doing is switching from supporting the business through the current set of policies to a set of policies which try and boost demand. And it's about trying to get people out again, give them confidence again to go out and spend. Now, how should we go about doing this? Well, there are a range of options. One option, which has been suggested in a number of places, is that we have a temporary VAT cut. Now, yes, we could definitely do that. The issue from a local perspective is that somebody could take advantage of the VAT cut by spending online, for example. Now, from a national perspective, that doesn't really matter. You know, that is going to add to GDP, and that's good from a national economy perspective. But if we think that trying to support local amenities and local businesses is important, you know, from an amenity perspective, but also from an employment perspective, that clearly is not going to sort of have as much of an impact as potentially what we might want to do. Second option could be to offer a very specific tax cut, say to alcohol duties for pubs, for example, to try and get people out. That would, of course, you have to go to the pub to get that discount, and so it might well get people out. But it's quite narrow at the same time. It's only supporting pubs rather than the much broader array of local services businesses that exist, so that perhaps that's too narrow. The third option is to offer vouchers to spend locally. So every household will get a voucher that would entitle them to go and spend that within, say, the same local authority that they live in. They can't go and spend it elsewhere, and if you don't spend it, you lose it. And it could be issued, say, on a weekly basis. You get a voucher, it lasts until Sunday, then it expires, then you get another voucher which, say, lasts till the next Sunday, which you can go and use locally. And that's a way to try and potentially tempt people out. In addition to this, as well as those policies to try and get people out spending, you know, a big challenge that business is going to face, that we all know, or local services businesses will face, will be the restrictions that social distancing place on them. So, for example, a restaurant won't be able to serve as many people because it'll have to spread its tables out. A shop may not be able to admit as many people because for social distancing as well. Now, what a local authority could do, rather than national government, is to have a change in terms of its approach to planning in respect to this. So all of a sudden, it could open up the pavements in front of these types of businesses to allow them to trade out on the street, particularly for cafes and restaurants. If there's a parking space beyond that, they could close the parking space and give the business access to that. Or you could have some sort of flexibility around the meanwhile use of other spaces that are currently empty to allow businesses to temporarily fill them, so they can actually increase the floor print and then continue to serve as many people in principle as what they were before the crisis came in. What that probably will also mean is that we have to look at road closures within particular places too, because if you're allowing businesses go onto the pavement, then where the pedestrians go, well, you need them to go onto the road, which means that you have to stop cars coming down the street. But there are a number of planning things that we could do to try and make sure that we are supporting these local services businesses to allow them to get back on their feet and trading again and getting money in their tills. Of course, by removing the furlough scheme in particular, that does open up these businesses or workers in these businesses to actually lose their jobs, which is a risk of, pulling some of these policies back. And so in order to deal with that, the furlough scheme should transition from what it is currently into an employment skills programme. But I'll come back to that in just a second. And then the final issue to think about is costs still, in that these local services businesses have been closed for a period of time. As I said earlier, there's still been revenue or expenditure going out on rent, etc., while they're not earning any money. And it does mean that a number of businesses have probably built up quite a lot of debt over this period. Now, that's not a particular issue if you're a very profitable company, but say if you're an independent cafe or shop and you make a profit but not particularly big profit, then to be saddled by all of this debt could well be a very big issue in terms of sustainability of that business. So there's a question here about what do we do about that? And does that mean that the government steps in as a mediator between, say, landlords and tenants, for example? And some of you may have heard the issues of Travelodge on the radio this morning. Or does the government have to take a hit on that and absorb some of that cost itself to allow these businesses to be viable? We haven't got any quick answers to this, but it does feel that these are questions that we need to answer, and this framework at least brings some of that out to allow us to think about what the more sensible policy route forward is. And then finally, we move into phase 3, so the final of the phases. And this is where all businesses or all support moves from supporting businesses through to more directly supporting workers who've lost their jobs. Now, I've got an image on here which might look slightly bizarre. This is what websites looked in 1997, which I had an excellent reminder of when I went searching for the New Deal policy. So that was worth putting that as much as anything. But what are the options that you could then put in place for this? Well, we've got some history around this. So in 1997, the Labour government brought in the New Deal programme, which is about trying to give young people skills to get back into work with job placements in some instances as well. Fast forward to the last recession in 2009, we had the introduction of the Future Jobs Fund, which was about a jobs guarantee for young people who'd been unemployed for 6 months or more. It was scrapped quite soon after it was put in place, but then the later evaluation showed it being very successful. So there are these types of policies that we could put in place, which would be a mix of skills plus a guarantee of a job at the end of it for a short-term period in order to try and deal with the scarring effects of unemployment in particular. And that could be matched, say, with the government creating a big scheme around retrofitting of houses, for example, which could then create a load of jobs which could be used in the job placements, or could do a number of other things to try and create those jobs. Another approach that could be done is to create an adult education or adult learning account where individuals get money to go and spend on particular courses. And the government could incentivise some courses more than others, let's say in the green economy, by giving them a greater subsidy than perhaps other types of courses to try and encourage people out to reskill, upskill, and make them even more employable in the future to deal with the impact of the short-term impact of the recession. So where does that leave us? Well, quick recap. We see this as being an issue of 3 phases with different policy approaches in each. And the approach we take in each phase varies according to the different types of businesses. So for exporting businesses, those businesses that bring prosperity into an area, you would keep policies as they are until the end of phase 2, and then you would transition out to supporting the worker rather than the business. For local services, we take a slightly different approach. In phase 2, this transition phase, we'd move away from just supporting the business directly through the policies that are in place to be much more about trying to get people out and spending again and trying to get money through the tills before then moving on to an all-out skills and employment programme. But what does that then mean for the longer term, finally? Well, hopefully, when we come out of this recovery sooner, or this recession sooner rather than later, there is a longer term challenge that the government needs to be thinking about and needs to be thinking about now. It was thinking about levelling up beforehand and had an industrial strategy too. What does that all mean in light of the recovery? Well, I think it just stresses these 2 things even more. If we think about the idea of these exporters, being the real heart of the local economy. The big challenge for certain parts of the country is that they haven't attracted in these exporters in the way they need to, and particularly very highly productive exporters. So when we're then thinking about the levelling up agenda plus an industrial strategy, the focus needs to be on about how do we try and get these exporting businesses into certain parts of the country to drive up wages, drive up productivity, and then drive up jobs in local services as a result. And maybe some very specific policies that the government wants to do around particular industries to help support that too through the industrial strategy. But that's what we need to be thinking about, even more so after the recession has had its full impact, because it might well be the case that the existing inequalities we see across the country become entrenched as a result of what's happening in the last couple of months and what is continuing to happen now. Back to you, Andrew.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Paul. We've got a couple of questions already around points of clarification for Paul about, crudely on what's in the local services bucket, what's in the exporters bucket. A lot of that detail, or all of that detail, is available on our website, and we'll make the links available after the event as well. So if you're curious about the definitions associated with those kind of things, does it include shops, for example? Yes, it does. Then you can we'll make sure that you can get that via the webpage for this particular event. But let's move on to our second speaker. We've had some questions, as I said, keep them coming in. Our second speaker, many of you will know her, Vicky Pryce, a well-known economist, lots of different roles, board member of the Centre for Economic and Business Research, former head of the government's economic service, a commentator on a wide range of different issues in relation to the economy. So, Vicky, over to you for your thoughts on the road to recovery.
Thank you very much. Very interesting outline of how we can get out of this with the least problems left for us in the longer term. But of course, there are a number of issues here. We just don't know how deep this health crisis still is. We don't know how fast we're likely to be recovering when you're looking at the world economy itself. We don't know how many firms, despite all the help that's been given to government right now, by the government right now, are going to be still around. And we don't actually know in which sectors that will be the case, although we have quite a good idea that IT technology firms are doing still quite well. We're seeing the pharmaceutical sector, of course, doing well, public sector employment doing well as well. And quite a lot of the people who are the sort of frontline workers, if you like, including carers, but also delivery drivers and postmen and rubbish collectors and so on, in fact, still working and working in quite large numbers. At the same time, of course, we've had this very substantial increase in the furlough scheme, and we just don't know how many people who are now furloughed, about 8.5 million, are likely to then lose their jobs. And much will depend on the type of support which Paul was outlining might be happening over the various phases. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty. The result is, of course, that economists now have resorted to just producing scenarios rather than forecasts, particularly as we just don't know what the world economy will do, and therefore whether some of those proper exporters, if you like, who are very, very important in some parts of the economy, such as car production and so on, are likely to be doing well or not in the future. And we had some data which has been coming out of China, which suggests that there is some improvement. We've got some data also from the US, which, although obviously there's been a very substantial increase in unemployment, that seems to have stabilized. Even here, when you look at some of the Purchasing Managers Index data, yes, still a very substantial slump happening this quarter, but that slump is easing a little bit. Obviously, there is a limit to how much you can fall. But within all that, we've seen quite a difference in terms of the impact that it has had on people. We've seen that those that earn more in general are the ones who are more able to work from home, and they have retained their jobs, even though in some cases, of course, they may not be paid as much as they would have been paid otherwise, but generally they seem to have retained their jobs. Some of them have gone into short-term working, which is going to be eased, going to be made much easier because the furlough scheme is changing a bit to allow for a bit of help there as well. But what we've seen is that there's a large chunk of people in the gig economy and those who are customer facing who will find it quite hard to get back to work, and who are the ones who have increased the numbers of those who are asking for universal credit. what it suggests is that the problems for the government financially, even though they're about to end the furlough scheme in October, as they say, are going to be quite significant and will carry on for some time. The fiscal deficit is increasing very substantially to possibly 13–15% GDP this year, certainly above 10%. Compare that with the 2% or 3% that was assumed in the budget of March the 11th, which feels like an absolute age ago. And if you're looking further ahead, the likelihood is that we're still going to have quite a large deficit to GDP ratio. There are some forecasts now that even by 2024, it may be 5% if we're lucky, certainly not going back to what was originally intended. And of course, debt will be rising. It isn't just the issue of how much we need to borrow to support what we're doing at present, but it's also how much we're going to need to borrow to support the problems that we're going to be facing in the future. Many firms which are currently having access to the various schemes, the bounce back loans and the other schemes that are there, where a lot has already been lent to companies, will not be able to pay them back. And there are suggestions that that percentage that will not be able to pay them back could be as high as 50%. And if that is the case, then how does the government deal with it? Does it create a bad bank, if you like, where it takes control of those debts and tries to sell them off at a discount, which has been happening to loads of countries in Europe, for example, that were hit by the financial crisis disproportionately, and where that is still the problem of non-performing loans. Otherwise, we're going to have a banking sector which is going to be in trouble. They have already, the banks, set aside quite a lot of cash to deal with some of those bad debts, but they may be considerably greater in the future, and particularly, as Paul was suggesting, in a number of sectors where the lockdown will be only slowly eased and relaxed, and they're going to have difficulty in the future too. So first of all, therefore, we have this uncertainty. This year alone, the government is likely to borrow an extra 250 billion, at least, if not 300 billion, more than it had intended. Our debt to GDP ratio is probably going to go over 100 and will continue to go up. There are again some estimates that it might go up to 160%. How do you deal with that? Do we need to worry? Even if we move to having more support for workers and the training and green and so on, that is still going to require quite a lot of money to be spent. At present, of course, we're borrowing very cheaply. 10-year bond yields in the UK were, when I last checked, 0.22%. So basically, the extra money that we're borrowing is going to cost us very little, compared to these enormous figures which the government is throwing at the economy right now, hoping that something will stick. So we can carry on doing this for some time. Admittedly, it's not as good as Germany, which is able to borrow at negative rates, although even in the UK, one of the bonds that was issued, a 3-year bond, did for a little bit actually have, the face value was positive on interest rates. The interest rate that was being charged, the yield actually turned negative, so people were prepared to pay, to lend to it. So that's good news, and with a bit of luck, that may continue, despite the fact we've had a downgrade in our credit rating. Yet again, we had another one when we voted for Brexit, and we had one before that, when we entered the financial crisis, and we've got another one now. Nevertheless, the markets don't seem to really worry at all about this, and are still prepared to lend, because of course we have the Bank of England, which is prepared to engage in unconventional monetary policy, use quantitative easing, and buy quite a lot of that debt that is issued in the secondary market. So anyone who is prepared to lend to us knows that there is a willing buyer out there if they want to get out of holding that bond. And the Bank of England is likely to do even more, not just the 200 billion as announced so far, but the expectation is to increase it by at least another 100 billion at some point soon. And we're seeing similar trends in the US and also in Europe. And interestingly enough, when you look at Japan, they've said there is no limit to how much quantitative easing they're prepared to do to keep rates very, very low and help the economy move. So fine as far as this goes. So in the short term, we can carry on doing so. Quite a lot of that debt has longish maturities, so we should be okay. But there is a limit to how far you can go with 160% say, or anything above 100% of debt to GDP ratio figures. And that is going to be a problem for the government, possibly. Obviously, in the short term, we'll need extra measures of the types that Paul has indicated. In the longer term, there are concerns. Quite a lot of what was said in the March 11 budget had to do with spending quite a lot of infrastructure money to help do that levelling up that Andrew talked about earlier and that Paul mentioned as well. That was a combination of infrastructure spending, but also looking at other aspects, whether it was skills, looking a little bit possibly at the green economy, but particularly, of course, spending much more on linking up the various communities in the north and elsewhere, where investment had been disproportionately negative in relation to what has been going on in London and the southeast. In other words, the share of investment going to the south had been much higher than had been the case elsewhere, and that had, if anything, become worse in during the aftermath of the financial crisis. Why had it become worse? It had become worse because after the financial crisis, suddenly it was realized that the debt to GDP ratio was very substantial, the deficit to GDP ratio was very substantial, and the main way of cutting back and getting back to some normality in inverted commas was by cutting spending more generally. Current spending was cut very significantly, and we've seen the problems of that in the National Health Service now, but also in lots of other services. But capital spending is the easiest one to cut. And the real worry that still exists now is that given the impact and the inequality that COVID-19 crisis is likely to have across the UK and affecting regions differently, and in many cases actually plunging some regions that depend a lot on, let's say, manufacturing exports into serious problems for the future, particularly as foreign direct investment is falling, investment plans generally are being cut all across, that the cost of levelling up is going to be considerably greater. But the potential will still be to cut back. And what, of course, needs to be done is argue very strongly in the economic case for not doing so in ways that affects the productive capacity of the economy, because the only way to reduce in the longer term those incredibly high and worrying figures in terms of the debt to GDP and deficit ratios, which would worry the Treasury without any doubt the moment the economy starts to recover, is to get growth back, and to get growth back in a sustainable way. And we do know from all the evidence and everything that you've all done that spending on that levelling up and on that infrastructure is crucial, as long as it's spent in the right way, is crucial to get the economy back on its feet, and is crucial to get sustainable growth happening in such a way that it will, by itself, bring those ratios that the Treasury will worry about down anyway. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vicky. Incredibly rich sort of insights and perspectives, which prompt loads of questions, particularly, curious about, as you were saying, the room for maneuver that we've got in terms of a leveling up agenda, given the nature of the debt and the deficit. So we're going to move to questions now, because there's loads coming in already. What I'll do is I'll ask you, I'll say who you are, and then I'll ask you to unmute and ask your question, and then I'll go to Paul and Vicky for some responses, and we'll do them one at a time. I think that kind of format works, and I might throw in one or two on the back of those conversations. But let's start straight away, because I think this is an interesting question. It's come up from several. Ben Hawes. Ben, if you're there, can you unmute and just ask your question, which is about the extent to which the government should be directional or deliberate in the things that it might want to fund under a broad banner of, let's say, infrastructure. Should it be much more deliberate about what it wants to do? But Ben, if you're there, unmute and...
I am, yes. Rapidly put my T-shirt on.
Good.
Yes, so, I mean, if we're looking at really major unemployment, then, it's sort of trying to shore up things that were there before can only be part of the answer. And I just wonder if there's a case for addressing, directing funds to areas of major national need. And the obvious one is housing. A lot of people are very precarious because of being unable to afford their housing costs. We need to build a load of housing. The government wants to stop relying on imported immigrant labour for housing. So, we have a need. We have a load of unemployed people. We have a whole load of new housing technologies coming on. We could train a 21st century workforce for housing and build all the housing we need. And, that would seem to tick a whole load of boxes.
Excellent. Okay, it's a great question. So let's go to you, Paul, first, because we've been doing some thinking around how you might do that, and that's partly behind some of the principles that you've set out as well. So your response to Ben's question.
Yeah, well, obviously the challenge with all of this in terms of the skills and employment response is, well, what jobs are you going to get people to do? And it feels that the government probably does need to make a couple of big policy announcements in this area to try and actually create those jobs, be it temporarily or permanently. I'd say housing is definitely one of them. We know we've got a big housing crisis in certain parts of the country. We haven't got it everywhere, but in some parts of the country, particularly in the greater southeast. And try to go on a programme perhaps to build some more houses is an interesting idea. There is a question about how the planning system may or may not support that, which may be more of a fundamental challenge, but definitely housing is one of them. There's also a second element, as I said, around potentially retrofitting of existing homes if the government decides that the green agenda is something it is dead keen on. And you could then see that a number of short-term jobs would be created in terms of doing that. The one caveat I would say to that policy recommendation is that, of course, you're going to learn a certain type of skill doing those types of jobs. And there's a question as to sort of how relevant that is in the longer term. But maybe we shouldn't worry about that so much if actually the things that have been learned are about communication skills, working in teams, not being unemployed for a certain period of time and the scarring effects that happen from that. So perhaps just those short-term benefits of that maybe is good enough for that type of policy.
Excellent, very good. Vicky, your thoughts on this? I suppose it's a bigger question about, how engaged should the government and the state become in sort of trying to direct the economic recovery rather than taking a slightly more laissez-faire type of perspective. So Vicky, over to you.
Yeah, there are two things. On the housing front itself, I mean, we do know that housing construction has quite a big multiplier because it tends to be local and you don't bring very many things from abroad either, so it doesn't have a very big input content. So it's good news, and also providing good housing has huge implications for the health of the nation too, for children having the ability to work in rooms where they can actually think, and generally you find that bad housing leads to worse health outcomes, and it's very costly. So it's a very good idea, and if the government is involved more directly in that, then obviously you still own an asset. So it's in my view, it's a no-brainer, and it's a very good idea. In terms of getting much more involved, we've already seen that government will be already expecting firms to behave differently, the ones that are getting all those big loans. There's a report today suggesting that it's whether you pay enough tax in this country itself matters and will matter. The expectation will be for firms to perhaps alter the way in which even they're domiciled. If they're domiciled abroad on some offshore finance center, they may need to rethink. And also, of course, there's a lot of talk about the types of pay you get at the top for firms that have been supported, also the types of spending that you make, whether you become more green if you get support from government anyway. But I think it has to be a mix of regulation and more active involvement. And yes, I would expect that at the end of all this, given also that the government is taking stakes in innovative companies, and we're going to have a much more dirigiste government here, which will be quite interesting given the composition, the fact that we run by this Tory government that now believes in free markets. So we'll see if this lasts once the economy starts to recover.
Well, actually, your final point there connects to a question that has been submitted from Susan, and she's asked me to read the question out. And it touches on this point that you made, Vicky, in your opening remarks around your thoughts about the government, taking equity stakes in firms. We've heard this quite a lot. If they're bailing out firms, we should take an equity stake in them. Obviously, establishing a bad bank that essentially, to try and ring fence some of the problems that we'll undoubtedly see as businesses are not able to repay the loans that they've accrued. So you start us off, what's your perspective on government taking equity stakes? You know, it seems to be a popular idea at the minute. Is there much to it? What's the evidence on this sort of stuff?
Okay, well, there may not be any option. There have been times, I remember, working for the government at the time when, the nuclear industry, became state-owned for a while and so on. So if they're in difficulty, then you may need to do that, particularly if they're strategic firms or strategic sectors, where you require government intervention for them to survive, if you think that there is a viable business at the end. Or, there are times where the government has privatized entities, but took on its own books the pension fund. So because otherwise the company could not be sold. So there have been interventions all along, and you can have a mix of possible combinations of what type of stake you may have, in inverted commas. So yes, I think that we could probably end up with something like this, and indeed there may be a need at some point for some of the debt to be converted into equity, the debt that firms will acquire, and that equity is probably going to be government owned, or possibly some outfit that will be set up that will take on those shares. After all, we did it in the finance sector with UK Finance, so that was set up at the time. So I don't see why it can't be done again for other sectors too.
Okay, excellent, Paul. Because it touches a little bit on some of the thinking we've been doing in relation to the future of high streets, which is actually we might need to think about how we deal with distressed properties that are on struggling high streets where landlords and owners are less willing to participate. So just say something on that, connect those two elements.
Yes, based very much on the same principles that Vicky's just set out. You'll be creating some sort of vehicle to be able to buy up distressed property in city centres in particular. We know that has been a big issue over the last 10 years, as landlords have got particular values on property, which aren't reflective of reality, but they don't want to write down those losses or crystallise those losses by selling on at a lower price or having rents at lower rent levels. But that creates a big issue in terms of how a city centre functions. And if you've got strategic buildings, in the middle of your high street that are empty and owned by absent landlords that don't want to write down the value of that loss and not having them used, that's a big issue that actually the government could now step in and actually start to deal with something that has got its roots in the last crisis about the overvaluation of property and the inability of city centres to then adjust and move on because we can't get control of those buildings and put them to more to better use. And so the government would take those assets with the negotiations from banks, particularly if they take those assets in, as the covenants are breached, and then we'll pass them back over to local authorities to use them as part of a wider regeneration plan, generate an income, and then sell them on.
Excellent, great. Okay, let's jump to, both of you mentioned the significance of skills and employment programs becoming much more important, and in some regards, we're going to have to be much more activist in the labour market than we have been probably for the last decade. Scott, if you're on the call still, I know you posted more than one question. I'm interested in your first question on skills. Can you, if you're there, can you unmute and ask your question about skills? Scott?
Yeah, hi there. I guess my question is about, we know that nearly every single government's had some kind of skill program for workers that have had varying degrees of success. I'm just interested in the panel's view about the optimism about how successful a dedicated skills program would be, given the most challenging circumstances that we've ever faced in peacetime, and really how we would be able to implement such a program in a relatively short space of time. Yeah. With people kind of running out of time now in order to get back into employment and find those new skills that will enable them to get back into the workforce very, very quickly.
Excellent. Okay, so Paul, start with you on that. Skills incredibly important, individual and at the city scale. But what do we know in terms of the programs that we think may have better than average effects? Yeah,
great question, Scott. I think the first one about timeliness of this and how quickly you can get these programs up and running is a challenge to this. And not only do we need to craft the policy, but we need to think about how can we try and get that delivered as quickly as possible, and that may be an issue. But if we don't deal with this problem, then we're going to have an even bigger issue on our hands about a lot of people and millions of people being unemployed, and the longer term impacts of that, as well as the shorter term impacts. And I think we probably saw the cost of that from the 1980s, when we did see, big declines in some of these exporting industries in certain parts of the country, especially heavy manufacturing side of that. There wasn't really any program that stepped in to offer retraining and skills or employment programs to any great extent. And actually what we ended up doing was to expand the welfare state and gently ease a lot of people onto benefits, which wasn't really a great outcome for them or the economy. In terms of what works around this area, we haven't got a lot of evidence to suggest what does or doesn't work. And that's a really big issue in this area that we need to tackle, I think, over the coming years. So what I would use this programme as being an opportunity of is putting something in place, but let's evaluate it properly. And even if it doesn't work as well as what we want, we at least find out that we know that we shouldn't be doing this sort of thing in the future. Having said that, the Future Jobs Fund was scrapped when the coalition government came in, and there was then a subsequent report done on it, I think it was by the NEO, which found that actually had a positive return to it. So there are learnings even from the last time that we did try this sort of thing at scale that maybe we want to go back to revisit and try and take the best bits of that to create a new policy.
Excellent, good. Vicky, I'll let you come in, but there's so many great questions. I want to kind of jump on to the next one. So Kevin Lloyd, Kevin, if you're there, can you unmute and ask your question about the opportunities for onshoring? Kevin?
Yeah, hi. This is really in the context of, an increasing amount of chat around deglobalization. So my question, which I've framed in entirely neutral terms, is would an increased emphasis on trying to onshore some activity to boost, the domestic supply chain for some sectors be practical? Would it be effective? And would it be sensible?
Excellent, very good. Vicky, so more active government, dirigiste, as you said, does that include attracting, stuff that has left our shores back? Is that feasible, possible, desirable?
I think you can do a certain amount, and it's absolutely correct that everyone is talking about this. There's one reason why one offshores, and that is because it's more efficient, it's cheaper, it's been good for the consumer. But of course, we had a completely free system where, well, in the sense that we hadn't been hit by the health scare, but also, of course, we're members of Europe, where you can bring things in very easily, and the supply chains were constructed that way. So changing that is going to be a problem, but it's also going to be a problem both ways. Bringing things in is possible up to a point, but there's no way we're going to have a fantastically efficient steel sector, for example, in the future. We're going to have to spend an awful lot of money, and it's not going to be worth it. And quite a lot of the supply chains, we need to go somewhere else because the specialization is there. And if we onshore, then quite a lot of other countries will also try to onshore. If it happens with everybody, then quite a lot of the supply chains that we have that we use to sell elsewhere. So, for example, we always complain that we don't sell enough directly to China. Well, leave for a moment where we are right now with China, but actually we do, because we sell quite a lot through the supply chain that goes into car manufacturing in Germany and then gets re-exported to China. So I think we both lose out, and I think the world will become less productive and the world will become more expensive. It does not mean that you can't do something, but my suggestion would be, if we are onshoring, let's onshore at least with very close links to the continent. And that should be the aim, to have a really good deal with Europe that allows for that to happen, so we don't have the extra expense, which really makes very little sense in many areas.
Very good, and touches on several questions that have raised the question that the combination, the double whammy effect of both the COVID crisis, the lockdown, and what's happened, and obviously Brexit. And our work shows that, unfortunately, when you look at the places that are likely to suffer the most from Brexit, and indeed have suffered the most so far in terms of the lockdown, they are one and the same kind of places. But John Goddard, John, if you're on the call, it's your second question I'm interested in, because it brings these two issues together and brings in a kind of point about what local actors might do. So John, if you're on the call, unmute, ask your question. Hi, John.
Hi there. Yes, I think this is a very key question. It is about Brexit is going to affect the most areas that are most affected by COVID-19, particularly left behind places. And we've had a lot of conversation about the skills agenda, and it raises the issue of who's going to deliver that. As it so happens, nobody has mentioned the role of policies for further and higher education and further and higher education institutions in those left behind places. where the government's just announced that many of those are in danger of going bust. The FE sector is in a very bad way, and there's no indication that any of the discussion that's going on in government about the future of FE and HE geographically is being considered at all. So what can we do to get some better connection at a national level about the local dimension and the role of FE and HE in the recovery process, particularly in those left behind places affected by the double whammy of these two factors?
Excellent. Thank you very much, John. Paul.
Yeah, great question. And on the onshoring point, the reason why those jobs are being offshored is because it's cheaper to do it elsewhere. So we're not talking about bringing lots of high value stuff back. We're talking about bringing low value stuff back. And where's that going to go? It's going to go to places that have got lots of low value stuff already. So that will create jobs, which is a good thing, but it's more of the same. It's not really pushing these places on. It's not really going to address the challenge that they've got. So even if onshoring did happen, we should be cautious about the benefits we think it would have. Which then takes us on to what do you then do and square into the skills field. I think what we would suggest is a very big expansion of funding for further education colleges in particular, and have that focused especially in left behind places where actually people there are less likely to go to university and more likely to have no formal qualifications at all. And the way to try and change that is to use the local FE sector to try and get them to what we would call level 2 skills, which would be GCSE level skills, or maybe even up to level 3, which would be A-level or equivalent style skills. But that's a funding issue. And what we know is that further education saw the lowest increases in the 2000s compared to school education and higher education. And we also know they saw the largest cutbacks after 2010 as well, which doesn't leave FE in a particularly great place. So I think that needs to be central not only to the recovery challenge, but also this longer term challenge of levelling up too, and that's a funding question principally.
Brilliant. Okay, Vicky. I mean, you're involved, have been historically, are currently in advising the Department for Business and other government departments. Just think about those kind of relationships, how they understand, place and the place agenda, and can they get their head around that, or do we really need to be much more fundamental in trying to organise some of these things at the more local scale? Vicky.
Well, I would say that one of the big losses is that we no longer have regional development agencies. The LEPs have done their best. The understanding at regional level remains not very great in government, and a lot more needs to be done, I'm afraid, to educate them. And it may all be lost because of the urgency right now to start to get the economy going. And I would not underestimate, though, in terms of future capabilities in the regions, the education, the skill side, which is absolutely essential. And indeed, one of the easiest things to cut after the financial crisis was indeed further education. And that needs to be looked at again very, very clearly. And of course, at the same time, we are going to have a crisis in the tertiary sector as well, with lots of universities and local ones and previous local polytechnics becoming universities. They will be the ones that will suffer quite significantly, I'm guessing. So what there will be at the local level, it's really questionable. The answer isn't just funding, it's also doing it right in terms of where that funding goes.
And that connects to several questions we've had, or kind of points have been made about, the need to support the capacity of institutions, whether it's local authorities or whether it's mayoral combined authorities, or or LEPs, and but the recognition that we need to build institutions that can actually grapple with some of these bigger questions, rather than expecting them all to do it on a shoestring, which we've kind of done, I suppose, for the last decade or so. Paul, your thought on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've got to have the institutions in place in order to be able to, I think, both educate national government, as Vicky says, but also then use that money in a way that can be best spent to the priorities of an area, because the challenge that Greater Manchester faces are very different to, say, what Bristol faces, for example. That will require a change in institutions, because we haven't got them there, or only got them in some places. We've got mayors in some places, but not in all places. And so you would have to have a change in the institutional structure. And indeed, we did a webinar on this a few weeks ago. So I was going to see you could do a whole webinar on it. We actually have done, and we probably will do another one too. So institutions are really important in this.
Okay. And a question, and I know we need to finish shortly, and I apologize we haven't got through all of them, but a question from Claire again, asking me to read it out. And maybe Vicky, you can start on this one, which is, what's your sense that the government is thinking through this point? I suppose one of the basic principles that Paul was making in his opening comments, which actually is, not all economic activity is the same. Some industries, some firms, some activities more important than others for a bunch of reasons, in terms of contribution to overall prosperity. Where do you think the government is currently in its COVID response in recognising and grappling with those kind of issues? Vicky?
This is going to have to be my last answer, because
Yes.
I will then go off.
You'll need to go and be elsewhere. Quite.
I think there's quite a lot of recognition that individual firms, like the car manufacturers, for example, are quite important for a particular region, and it's the reason why they're talking and prepared to give support. So we've seen also an extension, quite a considerable extension of the lending schemes that are out there to cover small firms and medium-sized ones and large ones as well. So I think there is recognition that they can't let some of those big firms go, because the whole supply chain then suffers. So it's not as if there isn't any caring about this. The question is whether the actions we got now are going to have the desired impact. And as I was saying at the very beginning with my remarks, the problem is it's not just local or regional, it's also international. And whether some of those sectors and companies survive in the longer term and therefore bring with them the entire regions or cities area with them, either down or up if they survive, it's still a big question mark. So I think we need to see how we're getting out of this crisis before some more directed regional policies can be put in place, when we know what's there and what will be there.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good point. And I know you need to leave. So if you drop off the call, let me say now, thank you very much as always for your fantastic insights. It's always enriching listening to you kind of reflect on the global down to the local and everything else in between. So thank you very much for your participation, Vicky. See you soon. Paul, pick up this question and re-emphasize this point about you have to really think carefully about different sorts of activities and the contributions that different firms and different economic activities are making to different places.
This is sort of crucial point. I think that this is the crucial point of the framework that we set out, in that we can go from saying, we've got to think about all businesses to actually understanding the role that different businesses play. And if we just focused on, say, the local services businesses like the shops, cafes, restaurants, etc., which say a lot of the high street policy is done in recent years, we don't really understand what generates the demand for them. And you can just focus on those shops and restaurants, but actually if you haven't got the exporting sector firing in your area, bringing money into the area so people then earn that money and go out and spend it, you haven't got anybody to sell to. So it's very much about understanding these roles. And it's not about then going into sort of individual, very fine-grained sectors. We're being very deliberate about saying, no, there's two broad buckets you need to think about, and think about in that context, and the links between will help you understand this issue, as well as actually understanding how local economies work more generally. The same principles stand for thinking about the levelling up agenda on a more long-term basis, as well as the recovery agenda. Vicky touched on this. One of the big frustrations around this is that there's very little data coming out about how these two types of businesses have been affected by the downturn. And yet the frustration about that is that we have that data, or we as the UK have that data, because we set up a furlough scheme, we set up other schemes where people have to literally go and apply. So we know what sectors are applying, we know in principle where they're based as well. And yet we haven't even got that information about the furlough scheme at the national level. So I can't tell you which sectors have been using the furlough scheme at the national level, never mind the local one. But if we could do that, we'd understand, well, in which parts of the country is the export base in trouble because it's using a lot of this support. In which other parts of the country is that not the case? So actually, when lockdown lifts, the exporters have been ticking along nicely through lockdown. People have still been earning money. And as long as they feel safe about going out, they will then go out and spend money on local services, which means that perhaps you don't need to make the same scale of intervention in local services in a place like Reading, for example, as a place like Blackburn, perhaps.
Great. Okay. We can squeeze in one more question. And the reason it's a specific, but actually it touches on a broader theme that has been through the session today. John McGill. John, if you're there, can you unmute and ask your question? And it's about how we, I suppose, lock in some of the short-term gains that we've introduced, or some of the short-term variations. How do we make sure that they last in the long term and don't get washed away in the pursuit of returning to normal? So, John, are you there still? John is not. Okay, so let me. We've had this question a couple of times, Paul. Your thoughts on, if we, and his point was that you were making points about, for example, allowing outside space to be repurposed away from car space, for example, to allow bars and restaurants to be serving outside. We've seen temporary cycle lanes introduced in many cities as we kind of encourage more walking and cycling, a more flexible approach to how we manage the urban realm. How do we lock those in? I mean, they are definitely kind of short-term interventions that really we would ideally want to happen in the longer term. Thinking around how we kind of lock those in so they don't get washed away then when we return to normal, whatever obviously normal might be.
Well, we're running an experiment by doing those sorts of things. And the key thing to not allow them to be washed away is to try and measure the impact of them, positive and negative, and then decide whether we should then keep them permanently. I guess the short answer is if people feel they've been a success, then there'll be a lot of support for keeping them in place. And so that's the way to get that locked in. And so in part, it's about actually doing this in the first place, running the experiment and seeing what people's views are, and then having a conversation about that longer term. Of course, not everything that gets put in place will be a success, but I think we need to then make the positive decision to say, well, actually we tried that and it didn't work for all these reasons, as well as other things where we tried them and they did work, and therefore we should put them in place. And no doubt there'll be lots of competing views on this, that taking away car parking spaces for restaurants will be great for certain people, but perhaps drivers won't like that so much, and there's a battle to be had there. And so getting evidence around this to support the case will be really important if we feel that actually having them sorts of interventions on a longer term basis is important.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much indeed. It's 12 o'clock, so we need to close. Thanks to Paul, who's still on the call. Obviously, Vicky's now left us, but thanks to her as well. Lots of questions. I apologize we couldn't get through all of them. We never can, but I think we had a good spread of different kind of questions. All of the framework that Paul was talking about and all the research that we've referred to is available on our website. You can get much more on that. Our next online event, next Thursday, same time, same place, 11th of May at 11 o'clock. We're going to talk through the High Street Tracker Recovery tool that we've been developing, and that will go live next week. So we'll give us a real sense as to which of our city centres fell away most rapidly through the lockdown and where they are in terms of the recovery. So we'll have a briefing that talks through that, and then we're going to aim to do that on a rolling basis, so we'll be able to monitor change over time. But thanks for joining, and I shall see you all soon. Stay safe and go well. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.